Computer. All right. Well, welcome today. This is a Hewlett-Woodmere Public Library lecture featuring Professor Ron Brown and his Great Cities lectures. Today we will be talking about Ethiopia. So take it away, Professor
Well,
Brown.
thank you very much, Nadine. And it's wonderful, as usual, to be back at Hewlett-Woodmere. And since we are, of course, in lockdown, and I'm here in Queens, and things are slowly picking up. But what I did notice, I went out this morning to get some groceries, and I was astounded at the number of small stores which had a closed sign in them for quite a while. Now, walking down the street, the sign has said for rent, and the store material is all gone. So I think we are going to be with this lockdown and some pretty tough times for the near future. But luckily, with new technology, and Hewlett-Woodmere and Nadine have mastered it, so we are putting these wonderful PowerPoints and lectures for everybody to join in. And so let's get going. Once again, my name is Ron Brown. I teach history, political science, ethnic studies at Toro College. We have a campus here in Forest Hills. And I am not only a teacher, but as a teacher, we have a lot of free time. So one of my wonderful trips back in January 2019 was to Ethiopia. So this talk is going to be not just about the great cities of Ethiopia, but also about my experiences in Ethiopia. Because it's, I always say that visiting a place is 50% the place and 50% the person. So once again, this is the outline. We'll be talking about Addis Ababa, which is the current capital. And that's, of course, where everybody flies into. So we'll start with that. Then we'll visit Aksum, which is the ancient city going back thousands of years to in the north. Then Lalibela, which was the second big capital of Ethiopia. And I happened to be there for the big holiday of Timkat. And then finally, back in Addis Ababa, I'll talk about meeting Lucy. Now, the picture on the right is an Ethiopian postcard, and you see it is the Last Supper with Jesus and his 12 apostles portrayed as Ethiopians. Typical Ethiopian art, the big eyes, the eyes really dominate the face. So let's get started. Well, my visit was January 2019. Now, if you look at the map on the right, you see where Ethiopia is. It's on that little arm that sticks out of Africa. Eritrea to the north has recently got its independence. On the other sides, it's surrounded by Somalia, which is a Muslim country. In the north is Sudan, South Sudan, and in the south is Kenya. So now Ethiopia is a landlocked country. Look at the map on the left. Somalia is in total warfare, and it is split up into 3 semi-autonomous regions. Djibouti, a little tiny former French colony, is stuck in there, which is now the major port for Ethiopia. So I flew into Addis Ababa and spent a month traveling around. And so let's get started. Well, Addis Ababa is now geographically almost right in the center of the country. That's where the airport is. That's where everybody flies in. Now, it is a relatively recent capital city. It was founded only in 1886. And so 125 years of the city. But it is a booming city. There are plans for giant housing developments, industry, manufacturing, international organizations are located there. And it seems every time you go out, you are struck by massive apartment building, factory building, administrative building, highway building, and railroad building. Ethiopia has traditionally been the poorest country of Africa. Africa is a poor continent. And so when you say Ethiopia is the poorest of the poor, that means very poor. Addis Ababa is growing in population by the day, people flooding in from the countryside. Very often there are famines in Ethiopia because it is high in the mountains, the rainfall is precarious, and so, as we all know, Ethiopia and famine have been almost identical for many years. Now, Ethiopia, if you look at the map on the top left, you see it is a mountainous area. High, craggy, ancient mountains worn by the weather. It is a very dry climate, as you can see in the other pictures. It is almost a desert climate. And so when the rains don't arrive, or they arrive too intensely, the water goes pouring down out of the mountains and literally washes away entire towns. So it is a rather bleak but strikingly beautiful landscape, largely denuded of trees. They've been chopped down and used as firewood or housing. And so it is rather arid, and again, leading to the mass migration to Addis Ababa. The city of Addis Ababa is growing, as I said, in leaps and bounds. If you look at the chart at the bottom on the right, we see in 1950, it barely had 500,000 people. And just year by year, the population explodes. It is approaching 5 million now. Most of them are peasants, poverty-stricken, illiterate, uneducated people from the countryside. And the pictures on the left, these were from the hostel where I was staying. You see miles and miles of shanty towns. Now you can imagine when there was a torrential rainstorm, half of these are washed away. But yet, money is flowing into the country. You see the building on the bottom picture on the right from my hostel. You see giant apartment buildings going up. China is pumping billions of dollars into Ethiopia every year, as is Europe. Not so much the United States, but Africa is really in the forefront of building a modern new Ethiopia. Another view from my hostel is on the right on the top. And so you see large buildings sprouting up. They're planting trees and trying to restore a little bit of the greenery. Now, Addis Ababa was built as the royal capital by Haile Selassie's father and grandfather. And one of the most beautiful views is of Holy Trinity Cathedral. Most of the population these days of Ethiopia is Christian. They are Orthodox Christians, similar to the Egyptian Coptic Church and some of the Eastern Mediterranean independent churches. They're not in union with Rome. They're not in union with the Greek Orthodox Church. They are an independent church with a lot of their own traditions. And you can see from the architecture, it could be called Baroque, but yet sort of distinctive. The interior of the churches are just covered in glorious paintings. The iconostas, which is the icon wall, is what we see in the picture on the right. You see the three doors with curtains. Like the Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox, the Ethiopians believe that the consecration, when the priest changes the bread into the body of Jesus and the wine into his blood, is so sacred that it should not be viewed by profane eyes like me. So they close the curtains for the consecration, and then once it is finished, the curtains open and they come out and the people take communion. A distinctive thing about Ethiopians is they love to portray the Trinity, God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost, as three people. It's rather rare in Western culture to portray the three members of the Trinity. But it is a proudly ancient Christian country. The thing that I noticed in Addis Ababa is the Chinese are everywhere. Posters celebrating Chinese-Ethiopian cooperation. United States is barely present. Israelis are there for political reasons, but it is the Chinese who you see everywhere. Picture on the left is the new electric tram, which runs right through the center of the modern city in the valley, and we're just down the hill from my hostel. And when you get in, there's a television screen in every car, celebrating Chinese-Ethiopian cooperation because the Chinese built this light rail. They're building other railroads throughout the country. Now, it's not charity. I mean, Ethiopia is rich in minerals. They're building factories for manufacturing. And so they have to get the finished products to the port in Djibouti and their raw materials into the country. So at the time when Donald Trump is so upset about us importing everything from China, well, if we start importing things from Ethiopia, the profit is going to go into the hands of the Chinese anyways, because they are transferring their factories to lower wage countries. So China is present everywhere. The Chinese just built a giant military navy port in Djibouti. Now Djibouti, that little tiny country in the middle of the picture on the left, is a former French colony that the French chopped out of what was formerly Ethiopia, made an independent country, and they remain there. They have a giant military base. Well, there's also an American military base there, and the Chinese just built a military base. And Djibouti is very important. If you look at the picture on the right at the bottom, you see the One Belt, One Road going across the mainland of Asia into Belgium and Moscow, France and Italy, but also going by sea for exporting through India, Kenya, Djibouti, a major port in the expanding Chinese military and economic presence around the world. Israelis are everywhere in Ethiopia for the simple reason that Ethiopia is a Christian country. So Israel cultivates ties with Ethiopia because it sees the Jewish country and Christian material is very, very important. And so the Israelis are definitely there in large numbers. I see my battery is running a bit low. Just one second. Okay, as you can see, the Israelis have cultivated countries on the periphery around Ethiopia. Historically, they have built bases. There we go. So my laptop is charging again. So the Israelis are building military bases. In fact, just two minutes from my hostel, there was an entire mountain crowned with Israeli military diplomatic presence because they see the Christian Ethiopia as an ally against the Muslim world, which of course does not make Ethiopia very popular among the Muslim countries, which is why Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf countries view Ethiopia with suspicion. So the Chinese and the Israelis are moving in force. Now, the one thing about the Ethiopians, which is very striking, is they are a fiercely proud people. We look at the map on the left, we see Africa as it was on the eve of World War I. Big red area, French colonies. The blue area from Egypt down to South Africa, British colonies. The Germans had Cameroon, East Africa, Namibia. The Portuguese had colonies. It seems that everybody in Europe was carving up Africa, the great mad scramble for Africa. But Ethiopia is white. It remained independent under Haile Selassie, who ruled from 1930, 1974. Only briefly during World War II did the Italians invade, conquer the country, ruled it for several years, but were then forced out. And so it was never a long-term colony of any country in Europe. So it is a proud country, independent country. Now, after Addis Ababa, I wanted to go north. Once again, if you look at the picture at the bottom right, you see Addis Ababa again, right in the middle. Go right as far north as you can go, and you see the ancient city of Aksum, sometimes spelled with an X, sometimes with a KS. This was the capital of ancient Ethiopia, going back almost 1,000 years BC, when Egypt was a major power. We can see in the picture on the left, Upper Egypt, Nubia, and down at the very bottom is Meroe, which was the capital of the ancient kingdom of Aksum. And so strongly influenced by Egypt. Now the Bible refers to the ancient Ethiopia, and it uses the name Cush. And in fact, in modern Hebrew, the slang term for a black person is a Cushi, which means a black person from Ethiopia. So the black people from Ethiopia would travel through Egypt and up into Israel and modern day Palestine. And so ancient Ethiopia was part of the ancient world. And in Meroe and Aksum today, we see the smaller pyramids and temples built in ancient Aksum, which still stand until today. Burial tombs, but you'll see they're very much influenced by Egyptian culture. So this was the ancient kingdom of Aksum, which lasted from about 1000 BC until 300 to 400 years after Christ. Now, I wanted to go to Aksum, but the political situation in Ethiopia is precarious. The north was basically in revolt against the central government. The far south was in revolt against the government. Different ethnic groups were fighting against each other. There was warfare with Eritrea and Ethiopia over the border. So I wanted to go from Addis Ababa up to Aksum, but as soon as I got near Aksum in my rickety old bus, the police stopped us. And the American government, State Department, called it a no-go zone for tourists. So I didn't get that far, but yet it is one of the sacred cities of ancient Ethiopia, even mentioned in the Bible. Now, the Ethiopians speak a Semitic language. The three major languages, which we all know of the Semitic language family, are, of course, the largest one by far is Arabic. The second one is modern Ethiopian. And the third, or even the fourth or the fifth, is modern Hebrew, which is relatively small language compared to Arabic and Ethiopian and other existing Semitic languages. The ancient language of ancient Ethiopia was Ge'ez, which is still used in the churches today. Although the language has emerged, sort of like Latin becoming modern Italian, or Biblical Hebrew becoming modern Hebrew, or Shakespeare's English evolving into modern American. Well, Ge'ez evolved into Amharic, which is the main language of Ethiopia. Church services are generally still in Ge'ez, which is a very ancient language, similar and related to Hebrew and Arabic. Every once in a while a word would come through, or sometimes a string of words which sounded so familiar because it would be the same word in Hebrew or Arabic. They have their own language and they have their own alphabet. And you can see the picture of the Bible. There's St. George with his sword. And the alphabet is a mixture of ancient Egyptian, Greek, and a little bit of Hebrew influence. So they have their own language, remember the Semitic family, and their own alphabet. Now, the Semitic people, as you can see, are largely the yellow area on this map, which goes from Iraq all the way across to Mauritania and Morocco, down into Sudan, which is Arabic speaking, the little bit of Hebrew up there in Israel, and then the various Ethiopian languages, which are sort of a cousin to Arabic and Hebrew. But since the Ethiopians lived in mountains, each valley sort of developed its own language and its own dialect. And so we see Amharic on Ethiopia, the predominant language, and you see other ones, Tigray in the north, Omro in the south, Somali is part of the same language family. So when I was traveling around, I felt comfortable because the language, I speak modern Hebrew, and I studied Arabic and lived in Israel and traveled in the Arabic world. So when I was in Ethiopia, I felt quite at home. The language wasn't strange, and very often I would even understand something. Now, very important for Ethiopian history and culture is the Queen of Sheba story. Now, we all know Queen of Sheba. She went to Jerusalem and hung out with King Solomon. And this was about 1000 BC when all of this is going on. Yul Brynner and Gina Lollobrigida, the Solomon and Sheba, one of these romantic love stories of old time. Well, in the West, Queen of Sheba is always portrayed as white, whereas the Ethiopians claim that Sheba, the kingdom of Sheba, is the ancient Ethiopia. And so in Ethiopia, the Queen of Sheba, who is really one of the great heroes of Ethiopia, is portrayed as a Black woman, in spite of the whitening of her skin for Hollywood and Western paintings. Now, scholars until today are not sure where Sheba is. Some people say it was Yemen in southern Saudi Arabia. Other people say maybe it was somewhere in Sudan, but don't tell that to an Ethiopian because they will kill you on the spot. Sheba is another name for Ethiopia, and remember that. Now, the story of the Queen of Sheba is chronicled in the Jewish Bible, Book of Kings and Chronicles, where the Queen of Sheba went to Israel because she had heard of the greatness and the wisdom of King Solomon. Now, don't forget, this was the high point of the Jewish kingdom back then. It not only controlled what is today Israel and Palestine, but Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, up to the Euphrates. It was a major world power. Unlike today, where there are probably more Palestinians living in Israel than there are Jews, back under King Solomon, the Jews were a militarized small people who had conquered all of their neighbors and ruled over huge empire in the Middle East. And so the Queen of Sheba thought it was appropriate to pay respects to a fellow monarch who was reputed for his wisdom. And it said she gave the king 120 talents of gold and spices, very great store, and precious stones to show her respect for the great King Solomon. So this is the story as it is presented in the Jewish Bible. Well, in Ethiopia, this story grew in importance and was elaborated. According to the Ethiopian version, which goes back a couple thousand years, the Kebra Nagast, famous ancient document of the Queen of Sheba story, Queen of Sheba and Solomon evidently hit it off pretty well. So needless to say, 9 months later, when the baby arrived, he became the king of Ethiopia when the Queen of Sheba passed on. And he was Menelik the First, who the Ethiopians claim was the son of King Solomon. Now remember, back in those days, Judaism was passed on through the father, not the mother. Like in Abraham, God promised to make Abraham the father of a great nation. And he didn't mention anything about wives. It was only thousands of years later that Judaism switched to tracing the religion through the mother. So King Menelik said, I am the heir to Solomon. I am the heir to the kingdom of Ethiopia. So he went to visit his aging father to say, well, I'll take over when you die. Well, needless to say, King Solomon was not thrilled having this half-black guy show up and claim his inheritance, and treated him rather shabbily. So Menelik got, to put it in biblical terms, pissed off. And so he broke into the temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, stole the 10 Commandments, took a lot of priests and notables from Israel and took them all back to Ethiopia. And he claimed that he was the heir to the Jewish throne. Well, Jewish religious rituals flourished in Ethiopia. Until today, Ethiopians don't make a strong distinction between Judaism and Christianity. There's not one pig in the entire country banned by law. All men are circumcised. Ethiopian Christians celebrate the Jewish Sabbath, and they celebrate the Sunday Christian Sabbath. And so Judaism penetrated deeply into the Ethiopians. Now remember, the Queen of Sheba was still a pagan, and Menelik, when he went back, started practicing a form of Judaism. Well, under Menelik and his successors, Aksum grew in power. And here we see on the left the great Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, and the Empire of Aksum, which was not only big chunks of Egypt and Sudan, Eritrea and Ethiopia, but across into Yemen and Saudi Arabia. Kingdom of Aksum was in trading with all of the great empires, the Romans, the Persians, the Indian empires, the Chinese. In fact, you go to the ancient cities of Aksum, and it's not at all strange to find Roman coins, Chinese porcelain, silk from India, Persian inscriptions. And so Aksum was one of the great world powers, trading with the other countries. It exported ebony, the black wood. It exported elephant tusks and leather and gold and gems and spices. Well, eventually, Ethiopians accepted Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. So they consider themselves today as sort of both Jewish and Christian. In Jewish synagogues, well, they don't have synagogues. They never accepted the Western European synagogue system. The Ethiopian Jews had animal sacrifices in their temples. They didn't have rabbis as a Western invention. They had priests taken from the temple who performed animal sacrifices. Well, there was also influence. You had a very highly developed Jewish monasticism, where young Jewish men would go off into the monasteries and worship and pray and study their religious books. They never accepted the Jewish Bible as we have it in Western tradition. They have their Jewish Bible plus lots of other books. They had pilgrimages in Ethiopia to sacred sites of Jewish miracles. The Christians themselves are almost inseparable from the Jews. All men are circumcised, no pork in the entire country, all animals are slaughtered kosher. Every church has a copy of the 10 Commandments prominently displayed, the very ones that Menelik claims to have taken back to Ethiopia. Ethiopian Christians have a long history of building monasteries in Palestine and going back to Jerusalem because they claim that Haile Selassie is heir to the kingdom of Israel. So the Christianity and Judaism, which we separate so easily in the West, in Ethiopia, they are completely inseparable. This is the church where Menelik, Ethiopians claim, built for the 10 Commandments. And this church dates back to the 300s when Ethiopia accepted Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. And so, as I said, the Ethiopian Christians celebrate Jewish holidays and they have the Jewish Sabbath. And then they have the Christian Sabbath on Sunday. They don't see them as two separate religions. And so here we see on the right, Menelik I riding on his lion. Kings of Ethiopia, the emperors of Ethiopia have always called themselves the Lion of Judah. Well, Aksum eventually became a predominantly Christian country, and it expanded and flourished. The 6th century, you can see already the Nile River across into Yemen. Now, I couldn't get up there because the State Department, as you can see, called it a no-go zone. One of the most beautiful things about Aksum, which unfortunately I was never able to see, are the giant tombstones, which we see on the right, giant towers, carved out of one stone as a tomb. Now, Ethiopia becoming the first Christian country. In fact, Armenia and Ethiopia both claim to be the oldest Christian country in the world, going back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries, when the Germans and the British were still worshiping trees in the forests, and the Spanish and the Italians were persecuting the Christians. The Ethiopians embraced Christianity as the accomplishment of the Jewish prophecies of a Messiah. Now, Ethiopia has strongly influenced African American culture. During the civil rights movement and the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s, and even in slave times, the African American slaves looked to Ethiopia for inspiration as the mountain kingdom of African Christianity. On the right, we see the current Church of Abyssinian Baptist, which is up in Harlem, which is founded in 1808. And even though it's a Baptist church, it named itself after Abyssinia, which is another name for ancient Ethiopia. During the American Revolution, so many African slaves deserted the American cause and fled to the British troops. The British established the Ethiopian Regiment, fighting for the liberation of slaves in America. So if the British had won the American Revolution, slavery would have been abolished in the 1700s. But since George Washington won the Revolution, as a major slave owner, slavery remained for another 100 years. But the chapter of the Ethiopian Regiment in the British Army, even some of George Washington's slaves ran away from Mount Vernon and joined the British cause. The Rastafarians, until today, venerate Haile Selassie as a prophet, if not a god. Bob Marley, the album at the bottom, you see the Star of David and you see the crown on the Lion of Judah. This centrality of Africa to Black history is the reason why the African Union, which is established after World War II, has its headquarters in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, and the United Nations has various agencies in Ethiopia. Well, the kingdom of Aksum grew and became very important, but still the links between Judaism and Christianity remained very strong. In the 960s, Gudit in Ethiopian, or Judit, a Jewish princess, seized the throne and said, "We will remain pure Jews, get rid of all this Jesus the Messiah business." Tens of thousands of people were forced to become Jewish again. Christians were persecuted, churches and monasteries destroyed, and she killed the last emperor of the line of King Solomon and Menelik I, and ended up plunging the country into civil war. She was eventually caught and executed, but it marked the end of the kingdom of Aksum. Now, there are still many people in Ethiopia who claim to be Jewish, although it's very difficult to draw a distinction between what is a Jew and what is a Christian, since, as I said, all Christians practice many forms of Judaism, and the Ethiopian so-called Jews practice many forms of Christianity. Well, Israel saw these Ethiopians as a great source of immigrants. And so they took approximately 150,000 back to Israel. Now, of course, they were not technically Jews. They practiced a form of Judaism. They had a different Bible. They didn't have rabbis. They had priests. They had temples where they were sacrificing animals. When they got to Israel, all of these Ethiopian cultural relics were rejected. They were forced to put on, as you can see in the picture on the right, the black hat of the Orthodox Jews. Their language was stamped out. Their temples were shut down. Their priests were arrested. The monasteries were shut. And that caused a lot of anger among the Ethiopians, who resent very much the Israelis destroying their culture and forcing them to become like Eastern European Orthodox Jews, which is the only recognized form of Israel. But 150,000 were taken to Israel. Most of them live in the large cities around Tel Aviv, where they are predominate in large urban Black ghettos, similar to the American cities. Their standard of living is very close, a lot of drug addiction and crime, and it's a very complex story of these so-called Beta Israel or the Falash Jews, still a major problem in Israel today. Well, with the overthrow of the Jewish queen and the return of Ethiopia to its half-Christian, half-Jewish roots, Emperor Gebre Meskel Lalibela, another descendant of Menelik I, took the throne. Well, Aksum, as you can see in the map on the right, far north, was in ruins. Well, he built a brand new city called Lalibela, which was actually his name. And that's where he built his new capital, which he called a New Jerusalem. On the left, we see King Lalibela on his horse. And Lalibela, as you can see the book in the middle, visiting the New Jerusalem, became and is until today the most visited site in Ethiopia. It has the magnificent stone churches. Now, Ethiopia the Chinese are building roads and railroads and tunnels and everything, but still the road from Addis Ababa north is still a construction site. So I didn't want to fly because I love to see the landscape and see the people, and buses break down while you get out and you talk, and it's half of the experience. So I decided to take the bus from Addis Ababa to Lalibela. And they said, oh, it's not that far. It's a little bit over 400 miles. Well, I figured do it in an afternoon and get there in the evening. Well, this is Ethiopia. It ended up a 17-hour bus ride. I mean, I never saw so many overturned buses and trucks, narrow roads, very often muddy. Picture in the middle shows going through a lush valley, but it is still a mud road, and tires would explode. You'd have to get off the bus. More than once I had to get up and help push the bus back onto the highway. But that's half of the fun of traveling. Now, I could have flown, but I didn't want to. I took the bus, very similar to the one on the right. People piled in all over the place. Now, the Ethiopians not only have their own unique alphabet and culture and language and everything, they have their own clock. The new day starts at 6 a.m. in the morning, meaning at 5 a.m. it is Thursday. Soon as 6 a.m. in the morning happens, it is Friday, which makes perfect sense. You get up in the morning, you look around, I wake up 6 o'clock, sun is streaming in my window, it is 6 o'clock, well, a new day. So we should call it the new day, not why do we have a new day beginning in midnight? You sleep right through it. So the new day begins at 6. So when you buy a ticket for an airlines or a bus or anything, you always have to say, is that Ethiopian time or is it Western time? Which makes a problem because you buy a ticket, it said the bus is going to be leaving for Lalibela at 1 a.m. You think, oh, it's going to travel halfway through the night. You get there at 1 a.m. and they say, no, you have to sit here for 6 hours or else you miss the bus. So I took the bus and went north 17 hours. Well, I was lucky because I was up there for the great holiday of Timkat. Now look at the Ethiopian faces. Most of them have very dark skin, but their features are very much like Arabs and Jews, meaning small nose, small lips. Many of them have long, curly, but not African style hair. So a very distinctive looking face. You can always recognize an Ethiopian because of their facial characteristics. Now, Lalibela built his new capital because by his rise to power back in the 1100s, the Muslims had already conquered the coastal area. They had conquered North Africa and the Middle East. And so it was no longer possible for Ethiopians to make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So he built a new capital city, which he named New Jerusalem, and it was to be a model, reduced model of the ancient holy city of Jerusalem. Here we see a tourist map, which I got. You see, this is his New Jerusalem. Now, Beit, B-E-T, you see, is the same thing as Beit in Hebrew, Beit in Arabic, and it simply means a house. Beit Midrash is simply an old synagogue or a house of worship. And so it's the same word in Ethiopia. So this is Lalibela's New Jerusalem. You see the river going through? Well, of course, it's going to be called the Jordan River. You see Beit Golgotha. Golgotha is the hill where Jesus was crucified. You see the Church of Christ. They built a tomb of Adam, the Church of Mary, Church of the Virgin, Church of the Cross, churches to Gabriel and Raphael, their base houses to Moses and to Abraham. And it is basically a history of Judaism and Christianity, history of Ethiopian religion in the language of stone. What is unique is these stone churches were not built. They were carved out of the mountain. So when we look at the picture on the left, we see the wall of a church. You don't see any stones. That is one giant stone where everything which was not church was carved away. They tunneled in, carved out the interior like a cave. And so the church is one giant rock. Paintings and stone carvings on the inside. Picture on the right, you see the steps going up and into another cave. That is the tomb of Adam. Tombs, memorial tombs to all of the great figures of the Jewish and the Christian Bible. And if you look closely, the picture on the right, you can see the big giant walls on both sides. That is the mountain. They just carved a tunnel through to the mountain, carved away everything, and left the church standing. This is the most famous of all of the churches of Lalibela. Look at the picture on the top on the right. You see the top of the mountain. So they just dug down, carved out of stone, leaving the roof of the church. And on the bottom, you see just carved out one giant rock, carved into it, opened it up, and made a church inside. This is the Church of St. George. You can see on the left, once again, St. George slaying the dragon. That's me standing there beside the Church of Lalibela, the Church of St. George. Now, I was lucky because the feast of the baptism of Jesus, the Epiphany, was celebrated on January 18th, 2019, for an entire week. Well, Lalibela, being the most sacred city in Ethiopia today, the religious center of the city, was literally filled with pilgrims coming from all over Ethiopia. And back in those days when people could still travel by air before the pandemic hit, tourists were flying in from all over. It was almost impossible to find a room. I was sharing a room with a Frenchman and his wife and their son, everybody just sleeping on the floor because that was all that was available. Now you can see the Ethiopian priests always carry umbrellas because the sun is very high. The altitude of Lalibela and Addis Ababa is the same of Mexico City, meaning the air is thin and it is dry. It'll be 90 degrees during the day and drop down to 30 during the night. And the vestments that they wear are silk and embroidered, beautiful silk umbrellas, basically against the sun. They are parading through the city going from church to church where they would offer prayers, non-stop church. Every priest from a church would come with hundreds of his parishioners, sleeping in tents and on the ground, performing religious rituals all the time. Incense was ever present. Now, the time of January, the Epiphany, is the celebration of the baptism of Jesus in the River Jordan. Well, when I showed you the map showing you the River Jordan going through, you can see that it was rather negligible little creek, not too much of a river. And you can see it on the picture on the right behind me, that bridge going across this little Jordan River. So as in the middle picture, they would set up hoses and they would spray people as a symbolic baptism. But yet there were still some young guys who would take off their shirt and pants and leave on their underwear and jump into the actual Jordan. And it was considered a great honor to be actually rebaptized in the River Jordan. Here on the right, you see hundreds of young guys in the Jordan where they would dam it up and jump in and splash water up on the women who were up on the bank. This was considered a great fun thing to do. I didn't do it, but a great fun part of the holiday celebration. On the left, you see a very classic Ethiopian cross. They are made out of brass. In fact, I have one here in my apartment, which I can show you. It's one of the nice things about doing these Zoom conferences at home. I can just go and get something. And so this is the cross. You can see it's highly elaborate, mainly a Greek cross with 3 equal ones, but highly decorated, as the one on the right, holes punched through, very strong, and this is what the priests would hold up during Mass. And I was lucky enough to convince one of the artists to sell me this. But you know, usually I don't buy things anymore. I have enough stuff in my apartment, but that I had to get. Here are more pictures. You can see the priests in the upper left. Now they are holding something on their head. As I mentioned earlier, the centerpiece of every church is the iconostas, the wall with the curtains, and behind the curtains is the most sacred object in the church, and that is a carved copy of the 10 Commandments, which Menelik I allegedly stole from the temple in Jerusalem and took back to Ethiopia. Well, each church has a copy. So when they come to Lalibela for the Timkat holiday, they bring their sacred 10 Commandments and they carry it above their head as they walk in processions. On the right, we see all of the kids from the church dressed up as like altar boys or servants in the church, accompanying the priest and his sacred copy of the 10 Commandments. Other churches would sponsor a painting of the wonderful event of Jesus's baptism. If you look closely, you'll see that in the painting, the people in the picture have these same big eyes, dark skin, but very, very Western features. Look at the kid on the right in the front. I mean, dark skin, curly hair, but facial features are very, very Semitic or even European. Typical artwork, which was just everywhere. The interior of every church, as you can see on the right there, again, you see God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost. You see St. George, Angel Gabriel, all of the events of Jesus's life. The walls of every church inside are covered with paintings. No statues, because that's considered idol worship, but paintings abound. In the middle, you see a guy selling his brass work, the crosses. In front of him is a Bible. The Ethiopian Bible is twice as long as the Christian Bible, We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the epistles and other writings. But the Ethiopian Bible has many, many more books. It's about twice as long. In fact, some of the most ancient early Christian manuscripts, which were lost in the West, are preserved in the Ethiopian Bible, as are many of the ancient writings of ancient Israel, which were lost in the many wars, are contained in the Ethiopian Jewish Bible, which is also twice as long as the Jewish Bible, which we use in the West. The paintings on the left, you see the big eyes, the dark skin, the narrow nose, small lips on these textile paintings. And this one has 4 figures of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, my last wonderful experience was going back to Addis Ababa and spending another week there. Having spent a week there before I went up to Lalibela in the north, I always like to go back to the place I began, go to the same hostel, and I feel like I'm coming home, so I can relax. Well, I went to the Ethiopian National Museum. Now, you may have heard of Lucy or Lucy's Child. This is one of the most ancient skeletons we have of one of the first humanoids to have come down out of the trees in what is considered modern-day Ethiopia and start walking upright. And so human evolution took place in what is today modern Ethiopia. So that's me there standing beside a drawing of Lucy walking upright. And behind me are some of the bones and some of the exhibits. Now, I found out later that the bones in the case, those were the ribs and some of the spinal bones, were copies because the original bones are so fragile that they are kept under lock and key. But Ethiopia is where humans evolved from apes. Now, why is Ethiopia such a rich area for anthropological resources? Well, I'm sure you've heard of the Great Rift Valley. On the 2 pictures on the right, we see the Great Rift Valley. In both of these pictures, you see a crack going down the middle of the valley because the mountains on the left are stationary. The mountains on the right are moving away from the continent of Africa. Look at the map on the left. You see the Great Rift Valley, that black line going down through the middle of Ethiopia, down into Kenya. All of that area to the right of the black line is moving out into the Indian Ocean. If I give this talk again in a couple million years, Ethiopia is going to be an island floating around in the Indian Ocean. See the picture on the right where there's a Somali-African plate. That is Ethiopia, Somalia, Kenya, gradually drifting off, separating from Africa. Well, as these areas split open, it's not at all unusual to have an earthquake and you see a giant split going down the middle of the road you want to cross or something. Very, very deep cracks as the earth splits apart. Well, that reveals the landscape as it was millions of years ago. Lucy, they believe, lived at about 4 million years ago, and her lineage became extinct about 2 million years ago. Well, as the earth opens, anthropologists and archaeologists go down into these pits and they discover fossils going back to these millions of years ago. On the right is probably what Lucy looked like. I mean, not going to win any beauty contests, but you can see the high brow above her eyes, very residual of the African ape ancestors, the heavy mouth, very, very heavy body. Lucy's line became extinct about 2 million years ago, but other branches of these early humanoids who came down from the trees, they ended up surviving, and I'm one of the descendants of our ancient African ancestors. So the Ethiopians spend a lot of money on museums and on anthropological research. In fact, when I was at the museum, the historical museum, I mean, there were Germans and French and other people there studying and lecture. Students were arriving because it was January. So groups of students would be over there doing anthropological research. So it is one of the exciting things about Ethiopia. Now, the political situation in Ethiopia is complex. Eritrea and Ethiopia, as you can see on the maps, were at war for a very long time. Eritrea wanted independence, and its capital, Asmara, finally became independent after decades of civil war. The map on the left, it shows the Somali state, Ogaden. These are predominantly Muslim people, speak Somali, which is related to Ethiopian, but different. They want to be part of Greater Somalia. So in the north, you have various groups fighting for their independence. The whole eastern part wants to be united with Somalia. So the political situation is dangerous. That's how I couldn't go up to Aksum, because there was renewed fighting. I wanted to go down to the Ogaden area, but again, there was fighting. Ethiopia is a dangerous place to visit. I mean, I was robbed. In fact, when we get back to the hostel, that was the big topic of conversation. Who was robbed? How much did they take? One guy's passport was stolen, and I mean, but that's par for travel in Africa. And you stand out as a white person, and you stand out as a tourist. And of course, if you're a tourist, that means wealthy with gold jewelry, Rolex watches, and a pocket full of dollars or euros. So eventually the Eritrean war came to an end, and it's relatively safe now in that area. The Somali area is still in revolt and is still complex. A new complication is the Orthodox are 43.1% of the population, but evangelical Christians are growing, about 20% of the population, and these are new converts to the Donald Trump style evangelical Protestants. And I met a lot of American Protestant missionaries. So there's a very bad feeling between the new evangelical Protestants and the ancient Ethiopian church. And a third of the population is Muslim. So you see a very divided religious population, as well as tribal differences, causing the country to be very unstable. Nonetheless, the country is facing a glorious future. As I mentioned, the Chinese are pouring billions of dollars in every year to build new apartment blocks, new housing developments, factories, railroads, light rail, highways. And in my hostel, there were Chinese businessmen opening up stores, building apartment blocks. And so it is a country which is booming. And they sponsor conferences around the world. This is one that was in March of 2016 at the Marriott Hotel in Washington, D.C., where they wanted to encourage investment into Ethiopia. Chinese, number one, are economically. The Israelis are there to support the military because they see it as a country a Christian country at war with Islam, just like Israel is. So it's a fellow anti-Muslim country. So the Israelis are there, but mainly training the military and the secret police, not so much in business. So it is really a country of the future. For those of you who are brave-hearted and would like some adventure, definitely a place to visit. Well, once again, this is Ron Brown signing off. You can see a little bit of difference in the picture there. I didn't have a mustache, but I had hair on my head. And so now I shave my head and have a mustache. So each person has evolved, just like Lucy. I just hope I'm not fated for extinction. And this has been another in my series of great and sacred cities of the world. Once again, I only talk about a city or a country where I have been. And since I've lived all over the world, some 50 years of travel, and except for now during the pandemic, I am not going too much traveling, but hopefully when the pandemic is over, I will be visiting more great cities of the world, and hopefully the Hewlett-Woodmere Library and Nadine will invite me back for future talks. So once again, this is Ron Brown. I am signing off, and thank you once again to Hewlett-Woodmere and to Nadine for letting me give this talk. If anybody would like to contact me, just send an email to ronbrownmedia@gmail.com. If you have any questions or suggestions or something you'd like to, you think I should add. So I always enjoy feedback, and I respond within a day or two. So. Well, once again, thank you very much, and I hope to see you again sometime in the near future.